Well, quintessential Australian scene once again. Gum trees. Mr. Cat, the producer, is occupied. He's dug a little hole, and I'm not going to tell you what he's doing in that little hole. But today, well, he's cleaning up his mess now, which is good. Now, this morning, it is morning, he says, grabbing his nose. I'm interested in looking at the concept of not putting your eggs in the same basket, because with this so-called intergenerational report, which theoretically tells us what it's going to be like in 40 years' time, it's a little bit like looking at a crystal ball and asking a fortune teller to tell you what's going to be around in 40 years' time. There was one word which was used over and over and over again. That was productivity. Productivity. Because obviously we live in a growth for growth's sake society. In order to make profits, you need to grow. If you don't grow in a private investment for private profit environment, where shareholders in the stock market want a return every year, and if they don't get a return, they'll drift along en masse to another stock or share. The fact is, if you don't make profits, you don't get ahead. So what they're trying to do is squeeze the last ounce of productivity out of workers. And we see that in a variety of ways. Laws which make striking illegal in this country, except outside a bargaining agreement period when you've got to jump through about 40 hoops to take 2 hours off work. We have a situation where wages are kept low, profits continue to increase for shareholders and owners, while the percentage of profit which goes to workers is about half what it was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, 2/3 of profits which were made from an endeavour went back to the workers who created that profit. 1/3 went to the investor. Today it's the other way around. 2/3 goes to the investor, 1/3 goes to the workers who create the profit. So they've got a problem. They've got to increase productivity. They're hoping that artificial intelligence will somehow help them in that drive, but unfortunately what that means is rising levels of unemployment in a society where there is no universal basic income for individuals within that society. We find ourselves in a situation where productivity becomes the be all and end all. But the problem is, as a society, and it's not just Australia but most countries around the world, we've put our eggs in one basket. That's the private investment for private profit basket. Now, anybody with half a brain, maybe even 10% of a functioning brain, knows that if you put your eggs in the one basket, your chances of things going wrong increase dramatically. Even if you bet on, say, the greyhounds or horses or something else, or two flies going up a wall. Normally, you don't put all your money on the horse which is coming in first. You divide your bets. The same with superannuation companies. They have what are called balanced portfolios. Now, some do, some don't. So this concept of putting all your eggs in the one basket is ridiculous. And what we've done as a society, especially over the last 40 plus years, during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation period of our history, we've put our eggs in the private investment for private profit market, relying on increased productivity. And in Australia, we've created this Ponzi, that's right, a Ponzi economics which is based on increasing migration, which increases demand, etc., etc. So the populate or perish mantra which raised its head after the Second World War when the country was nearly invaded by the Japanese imperial forces, continues to dominate our thinking economically. And it's little more than a Ponzi scheme. We saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic when labour was in short supply because the underpaid, exploited labour that we relied on wasn't available. Just before the pandemic, 1 in 7 Australian workers was on a temporary work visa. That's right, 1 in 7. So let's get back to this increased productivity. You can't squeeze blood out of a stone. And as most companies are not involved in profit sharing arrangements with their workforce, what we find is in order to maximise profits for our shareholders, what a company needs to do is exploit its workers and exploit its customers, or the people it provides goods and services for. That is the underlying philosophical basis. Because over the last 40 years, what we have done as a society is actually remove competition in the economy. We just cannot have one economic stream based on private investment for private profit. There are other types of economic models which can be followed. We did our best as a society since deregulation occurred and privatisation to privatise almost every public asset available at the state and federal level. Public assets which were built up over decades, in some cases 100 years, of taxpayers' funds to provide services traditionally in areas where the private sector could not make maximum profits. And what we've seen is the privatisation of these services: aged care, finances, early childhood development, defence, believe it or not. 50% of people in the public service which deals with the Australian Armed Forces, the Defence Forces, is a private sector. We've seen the colonisation of the public bureaucracy by the private sector. At the state level, we've seen the privatisation of essential services like gas, electricity, roads, with the introduction of toll roads. And the list goes on and on. We've seen the privatisation of the airports, the privatisation of the ports, the privatisation of telecommunications. So all these public services which were cross-subsidised services to the population are now in private hands. And what do we get in return? Possibly increased variety of services, but at exceptionally high costs for the consumers and the workers which provide those services, who in many cases find themselves on individual contracts. So to try to squeeze increased productivity out of the private investment for private profit model without entering into significant profit sharing agreements on top of wages with the workers that provide those profits is illusory. It's madness. So we need a three-tier economy. That's right, a mixed economy to reintroduce competition in a corporatised marketplace where a handful of corporations dominate every aspect of our existence: finances, aged care, health care, and the list goes on and on. Pharmaceuticals. Think about it. So what are these types of economies that I'm talking about? Well, the first one, the one that we have, is the private investment for private profit model. We should introduce antitrust laws to break up these duopolies and monopolies which dominate economic activity and which by their very nature destroy profitability for everyone, not just major shareholders. So they need to be broken up. Although every incoming government talks about the role of small business and the fact that small business and micro business employs over 5 million people, over 50% of the population. The fact is that 95% of small businesses die within 5 years, and those that are successful are easily gobbled up by corporations who fear competition in that particular sector. So the first thing we need to introduce is antitrust laws to break up corporations, to force them to increase competition. The second thing is we need to go back and look at the reintroduction of public services for essential services. They were introduced initially because the private sector was unwilling to provide services because the profits were not high enough. Once these public companies became profitable, they became easy targets for privatisation. Because as we see, public companies belong to the government of the day. They don't belong to the Australian people because their ownership isn't incorporated in the Australian Constitution. So we should be looking at, with these antitrust laws, when these corporations are broken up, the public takes over many of these companies to provide basic services and essential services. How ridiculous to leave it to a private corporation to actually provide electricity, which is fundamental in any postmodern society, and we become hostages to these private companies and their drive to increase their profitability at the expense of their customers as well as their workers. The other thing I'm interested in looking at is a third tier to the economy, and that's the collective and cooperative tier. Collectives and cooperatives were part and parcel of the economic mix in Australia in the 1880s and 1890s, when there were no social security benefits and workers banded together to form mutual aid societies and form cooperatives. Now, the difference between a public service and a private investment for private profit model is people do not get rich in cooperatives and collectives. The whole point about a cooperative and collective is to create an economic system which provides long-term, steady employment, producing goods and services at reasonable cost for the community, giving back a return to the workforce which is shared, in many cases shared equally, in other cases there may be a little bit of variation. Now, most cooperatives and collectives, especially in the agricultural sector, were broken up in the 1880s and 1890s, when the agricultural sector believed, ordinary farmers believed and graziers believed, that if they broke up these cooperatives based on their particular field, dairy, wool, etc., that they would increase their profitability. All that's happened is that small farmers are fallen by the wayside and the large corporations dominate the economic field. We saw the demutualisation of many mutual societies which have survived for decades, providing services for their members, and those companies being put on the stock market. What demutualisation meant is that an organisation you had power in because you are a member of that organisation suddenly becomes an organisation where power is held in the hands of major shareholders. One share, one vote is the mantra in any listed company which is listed on the stock market or stock exchange. The dilemma is the cooperative and collective sector is almost dead in this country, and those few pockets which continue to exist have major issues regarding expansion. The cooperative and collective sector can actually provide useful, needed employment for large sections of the community. It could act as a competitive force against the public service or the public sector, as well as the private sector. One problem. Not one financial institution will lend money to the cooperative and for a cooperative and collective. You try to raise funds to establish a cooperative, and you will find the financial brick walls that you are faced with. In many regards, the Commonwealth Bank was formed by one of the first Labor governments in this country's history in 1911 in order for the banks to provide security as far as banking services were concerned, but more importantly to provide finances to small operators. So the cooperative and collective sector is can be a significant part of this economy. Productivity would naturally increase. Not productivity for productivity's sake or profit's sake, but productivity to keep people employed in gainful, useful enterprises which provide useful goods and services. Real competition in the marketplace only exists when you have three tiers to the economy. A mixed economy. We've had experiments where the state controls the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and they failed miserably. We've had experiments which we are in today, we are part of this experiment, where the private sector controls every aspect of our existence, but not just the private sector, but a very small corporatised part of the private sector which dominates the marketplace. So there is no competition. There is no competition in a public sector which is owned by the state capitalism, and there is no competition in a public sector, a private sector which is owned by, a small number of corporations. In order to introduce competition into the Australian economy and increase productivity based on the satisfaction of real, not manufactured human needs, we need to create a third tier. We need to rehabilitate the public tier, and we need to create a new tier, the cooperative and collective sector. In order to do that, we need a mechanism via which to finance cooperatives, people who want to form cooperatives and collectives and be part of the productivity equation. And I'm suggesting, well, it's not my suggestion, but what I would suggest is that 1% of superannuation, that's right, 1% of superannuation funds, and we're looking at $2 trillion currently, is set aside to provide seeding funding for cooperatives and collectives, which these cooperatives and collectives would pay back if they succeed. This is one simple way to actually not put our eggs in the same basket, which is the private investment for private profit basket. Interestingly, one of the central tenets of public interest before corporate interests, which I do these YouTube presentations for, is the creation of a three-tier economy: private sector, public sector, cooperatives and collectives. So if you're interested in following up these ideas, I suggest you go to the Public Interest Before Corporate Interests website, pibci.net, and if you see what you like what you see, I suggest you join today. You can join online.